So, water justice, it's a huge issue, and we have next with us Teresa Huntsinger. She is the program director for the Clean and Healthy Rivers program of the Oregon Environmental Council. Teresa has convened the Oregon Environmental Council Storm Solutions team and organizes workshops on low-impact development practices, and she also participates in the state's Integrated Water Resources Strategy Policy Advisory Group. And she's here to talk to us about water justice in Oregon.
F5 a minute. All right, thank you. All right, well, thank you for the invitation to be here with you today. So I'm going to talk about some issues that are, in many ways, actually similar to issues that Debbie talked about that are happening in California. You know, we think about water as, we think about Oregon as being a relatively water-rich state. And on days like today, it's sometimes challenging to remember that this rain is a blessing, and it is really a good thing that we have all this rain. But even though we are such a rainy state, we actually do have a lot of limitations on our water, especially since the east side of Oregon is much drier than the west side. We also have issues of water quality going on here in Oregon, so I'm going to just touch on today a few of the issues on water and justice that are playing out here in Oregon. So briefly, I just want to introduce you to the Oregon Environmental Council. We're a statewide nonprofit organization. Our office is based in Portland, but we do work all around the state. We work on 3 levels. We help businesses use more environmentally friendly practices. We promote smart public policy, so we're very active in Salem in the legislative session right now. And then we also provide individuals with resources to help them live green. So these some of the issues that I'll touch on today, and I'll be really sort of giving you an introduction to some of these issues. We don't really have a lot of time to get into them very deeply, but I'll be talking some about water rights and water conservation. We'll be talking a little bit about drinking water source protection and toxics. So water rights and water conservation. So similarly to in California and for most Western states, water law states that all of the water within the state is actually, it belongs to the public. But yet the state issues water rights to the person who applied for those rights first. So they call it first in time, first in right. It's also called prior appropriation. So it means whoever has the oldest water right is the person who gets that water. And if somebody has a newer water right and it's a short water year, that person that's called the junior user might not get the water that they need. Let's see. Let's go. Okay. And so you can get a permit from the state to use water. And we also have such a thing as in-stream water rights permits, which actually help make sure that there's enough stream in the river for the fish. But you do need to apply for a permit to get a right to use water. So who uses water in Oregon? Actually, very much like California, about 80% of Oregon's water withdrawals are used for agriculture. Municipal water use, which is the one that's called public supply, it's that little purple bar, is quite small compared to agricultural water use in Oregon. And industrial use is even smaller. So agriculture has a huge impact on the availability of water in Oregon. Come on. Finicky. Did you find another button that worked better? The mouse? Let's see. doesn't want to do it. Come on now. There we go. Okay. So, as I mentioned, in Oregon, even though we think of it as a wet state, we're actually limited in water availability. So in this graph, you can see that in most of Oregon, all of the water that we have has already been appropriated for use. So there's not really room for issuing more water permits. So all of the orange spots on this map are where all the water rights are already appropriated. And you can see in the Willamette Basin, right along the Willamette where it's blue, it's sort of one of the unique places in the state where there is actually a little bit more water that still hasn't been appropriated to anybody. So it's complicating this issue is that many of the water diversions are not measured. So people may have a right to use a certain amount of water on their land, but they're not measuring that, they're not reporting that. We don't really know if they're using more or less of the water than they have the right to use. And while there is an application fee to request a water right, there's no fee for the use of water. So while we pay a water bill, that's really paying for the cost that our municipality has to pay for treating that water and piping it to our homes. And agricultural users, if they are within an irrigation district, they also pay a fee to the irrigation district for getting that water delivered to their homes. But many of them also, there are a lot of growers who just are not part of an irrigation district and get their water directly. So they're not paying any fee necessarily to the state for the ability to use this public good, which is our water. So if water is a basic human right, then does the use of that water also come with a responsibility to make sure that you're using that water efficiently, that you're not using more than you really need? And if your water is something that you're not paying much for or not paying anything at all for, what's going to be your incentive to conserve that water? We don't, same as in California, we don't really have many regulations requiring conservation of water. So OEC is doing some work on agricultural water conservation right now because a lot of growers are concerned as we see, and we're concerned as we see the impacts of climate change, reducing water availability in Oregon, and population growth. Our limited water resources are going to become stretched even tighter, and there's going to be more and more pressure in the future. So we think conservation is going to have to be an important part of that solution, and it can often be the most cost-effective and environmentally friendly way to meet our water needs as opposed to, say, building more dams, which some water users are asking for. So these are just some questions that I wanted you to think about in terms of how we use water in Oregon. So this is an issue that is literally right in your backyard. I just wanted to talk about it briefly. Some of you are probably familiar with it. Residents of Eugene, you get your drinking water from the McKenzie River watershed. It's, for the most part, a relatively clean river and source of drinking water, but there is more and more development occurring in the McKenzie River Basin. There are over 4,000 septic systems that are above the intake point where EWEB takes in the drinking water, and septic tanks can be sources of nutrients, bacteria, pharmaceuticals. Let's see, there are 10% of all the homes on the McKenzie River are within 100 feet of the river, so there are impacts like removal of the riparian vegetation that helps serve as a buffer along that river. So there are growing concerns about making sure that this source of your drinking water is clean. And earlier this year, the Lane County Commission tried to take some efforts to protect that source of drinking water. But unfortunately, in the process, they didn't do, in my opinion, they didn't do a very good job of public outreach. And as the residents of the McKenzie River watershed found out that there were going to be these requirements, there was a big uproar that happened. And the hearing ended up being canceled, and then the county commissioners, before even actually having a hearing, just decided to cancel the whole process, not move forward, and it's basically been put on the back burner. So if you are concerned about protecting the source of your drinking water, You should definitely let your Lane County commissioners know that this is an issue that's important to you, because while they've put it on the back burner, it's something that's going to come up again, but they're going to need to hear from people that they care about it and want to have something done about this. So something to think about and continue to be aware of. Okay, so now let's get to this big environmental justice issue about water that's happening in Oregon right now. It's actually playing out in the legislature, and we're weighing in on some bills dealing with this. So you're probably familiar with the issue that sometimes when you eat fish can accumulate toxins in their flesh. So you often hear about mercury when you're eating tuna fish, for example. Well, this also happens with the fish that are in Oregon's rivers. All kinds of toxics like mercury and PCBs accumulate in the bodies of the fish, which can make them toxic for you to eat. And the way that the water quality standards work, as dictated by the Federal Clean Water Act, is that basically the Department of Environmental Quality has to basically put a limit on how much pollution it's okay to allow into our rivers. And the way they set those limits is based on the uses of the rivers that they're trying to protect, one of those being eating fish consumption. So as they're trying to figure out how much toxics it's okay to let into the rivers, they have to think about, well, how much fish do people in Oregon eat, and therefore how much toxics would they be exposed to from eating that fish? So they set what's called a fish consumption rate. And the fish consumption rate was actually rejected by the federal government, by the EPA, because it was too low and it didn't adequately protect people. And in particular, it doesn't adequately protect Native American peoples who eat more fish than perhaps the average Oregonian does. So DEQ and the EPA went through this long process working with stakeholders that was actually really driven by the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla and other tribes who were saying, hey, you're not protecting us. You need to acknowledge that we eat this fish and it's part of our tradition, it's part of our culture, it's not something we can just stop doing. So DEQ went through this process and changed the fish consumption rate to 175 grams of fish per day, which is the same as about eating 23 8-ounce servings of fish in a month. So that's probably more fish than you and I eat. But the idea when you're setting water quality standards is you want to protect the most vulnerable people in your population, not just the average person in your population. So now that we've adopted this higher fish consumption rate, it affects those toxic standards. So it means we can let less toxics into our rivers. So as a result of that, we have these tighter water quality criteria for toxics. Now they're being proposed to be some of the tightest standards in the country. And so the industrial polluters, the wastewater treatment plants are freaking out because they're worried that they're not going to be able to meet these standards. And they're going to have to apply for variances, and they're worried that it's going to be very expensive. So they are trying to ask the legislature to delay implementation of these standards, trying to get the legislature to step in and change DEQ's process. And so this really sort of begs the question, so if in fact it does mean that we would have to pay more for our sewer bill perhaps pay more for some of the things that are manufactured in Oregon, like our paper that comes from our paper mills, are you willing to pay those higher costs in order to protect people who are eating more fish than you do? So something to think about. If you think that it's an important issue to you and that it is an issue of environmental justice and we do need to reduce the amount of toxics that we're putting into our rivers, there are two representatives from Lane County who are on the committee in Salem. That is the first one that's taking a look at this bill. It's called the House Transportation and Economic Development Committee. And you might want to contact those representatives. Let's see there. Terry Beyer from Springfield and Nancy Nathanson from Eugene are on that committee that are looking at House Bill 2007, which would delay implementation of those standards. So you might want to contact your representatives. I would really suggest that you do.
I just would like for you to clarify, is the House Transportation?
Yeah, it happens to be in the Transportation and Economic Development Committee because it was brought forward by the industrial stakeholders who are worried about the impact on them. So it's not in the Environment Committee where you might think that it should be. Yeah. So, okay. So just a couple more things. So in addition to the toxics that we actually have water quality standards for that whole fish consumption rate pertains to, there are also this whole myriad of chemicals that are used in the products that we use every day that there actually are no water quality standards for. There is no set level for how much is okay to have in our rivers. And they're being found in our rivers, and they're also being found in our bodies. And some of them are cancer-causing. Some of them are endocrine disruptors that impact your hormone system, and especially the development of young children. So I'll just sort of skim through a few of these. So you've got the lining that's on nonstick pans, the spray-resistant coating that sometimes you spray on furniture or in carpets. You've got PAHs, which are sometimes a sealant that's used on asphalt. They're also just produced by cars every time your car is burning gasoline in its engine. Then we've got all kinds of chemicals that are in our soaps and cleaning products, perfumes and scents. Of course, the pesticides and herbicides, many of the current use pesticides are not regulated, and then pharmaceuticals. So these things are showing up in our waterways. And, so one of the questions for you to think about is who is responsible for this? I mean, you would think that if something is harmful to human health and to aquatic life, that we wouldn't allow it to be in our products, but currently that's not the case. And so we're working on broader chemical policy reform at the state level and at the federal level. There's also one thing that we're working on right now is working to ban the chemical called bisphenol A, or BPA, that's found in the hard, clear plastic bottles. It's often found in baby bottles. So we're working to ban BPA in baby bottles, sippy cups, and sports drinks, and also to create a certification program for Oregon companies that manufacture canned foods so that they can develop a certified BPA-free lining of canned foods. So that bill passed the Senate in Oregon, so we're excited about that. And yay! And it will be moving on to the House soon. We're hopeful to pass that. But so there are certainly roles that the government plays, that manufacturers play, and also that we play, because we're responsible for sort of making our desires known as consumers, and also for making choices and reducing our own personal impact. So one other example of one of these toxics I wanted to point out to you is called triclosan. It's the primary ingredient in antibacterial soap. I call this one out because it's one that just many people hadn't really thought of or weren't aware of. So triclosan is toxic to aquatic life. It has some endocrine disrupting properties. It's been identified by DEQ as a priority toxic to watch out for. And what's interesting is the American Medical Association actually says that washing your hands with plain soap is just as effective at preventing the spread of disease as using antibacterial soap. So you really don't need it. It's best to keep the antibiotics in hospitals, situations like that when you really need them, as opposed to on a day-to-day basis, because then you also create the problem of creating bacteria, antibiotic-resistant bacteria if you're using antibiotics all the time. So you can just watch out and try to choose products that don't contain antibiotics because they are available. And the nice thing about triclosan is that it is actually required to be listed on the ingredient list. So you can look on the ingredient list and know whether it's in there or not and just avoid it, whereas many of these other chemicals, they're not necessarily listed on the ingredient list. So that's one that you can definitely watch out for and try to avoid using. Oh yes, great question. So that stuff, the hand sanitizer that you use that doesn't require water, that's actually alcohol-based. It usually does not have triclosan in it. So that stuff is usually okay. Yeah. So, oh yes, another question?
How about polluting wells like the problem in California?
Oh, do we have that problem in Oregon? Well, we do definitely have problems of nitrate contamination of wells in Oregon. There are several groundwater management areas in Oregon where the wells are contaminated with nitrates, and it's coming from agriculture. There's really no doubt. I don't know of any, it's more in Oregon, we're talking about sort of individual backyard wells. And Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality's program for groundwater protection has continually been cut year after year. The budget keeps getting cut. So it's really, they're sort of just leaving it up to the property owners who have those wells to kind of figure out how to protect themselves. So it is kind of a similar issue to the one in California. Yeah. So one last thing I want to leave you with, and if you're interested in taking action on some of those legislative things I mentioned that are happening in Salem, out on one of the tables out here, I have a little sign-up list for the Oregon Environmental Council, and we have an action alert list, so we send out action alerts when we need people to weigh in on policy. I also wanted to tell you about a program that we have called Love Your River, where you can learn about things like avoiding triclosan, for example. We focus on one issue each month. That's something that you can do in your personal life to reduce your personal impact on our local watershed. So we try to make it friendly and fun for people to use, and we actually have prizes that were donated by, outdoor recreation gear companies that are incentives for actually pledging to take the action. So this is an example of one of the pages on the website. It's loveyourriver.org, and I encourage you to check it out. And here's my contact information for more info. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here today.
Well, we have a little time, so I'd like to talk with you a little bit more about the privatization of water. People may not realize, but privatization of water, like other public services, is one of the top agenda items for the multinational corporate framework that we live under. The general agreements on trades and services that are part of the World Trade Organization call for the privatization of public services, including health services, including educational services, and including water. And we're not just talking outside the United States, we're talking globally around the world that this is the case. There are some places, like when Bechtel Corporation moved into Bolivia, into Cochabamba to take over and privatize their water system, where they went in and not only did they take over the public water system, but they went and put meters on every private well. And they told the population that they didn't have the right to collect rainwater from the sky. That the water belonged to them privately, and if you wanted it, you had to buy it. On top of that, when you begin to look at the population of Cochabamba, which was more than 70% peasant indigenous population, they certainly couldn't afford to pay the tripling of the cost of water that Bechtel put on them when they began to sell water to the general public. For many of them, the cost of water that Bechtel was charging was more than half of their annual incomes. I mean, imagine more than half of your annual incomes for water. And of course, that led to protests in Cochabamba. Eventually, when the government sought to put down those protests, and some protesters were killed by snipers, that led to greater protests, and Bechtel was kicked out of the country, and Bolivia took back control of its own water by passing a constitutional measure that said water is a human right, not a private product. And even more encouraging than that, a few years later, Evo Morales was elected president of Bolivia, and we're seeing real social change take place in Bolivia and other South American countries that resists this neoliberal corporate agenda to privatize all public services. It's also happening in the United States. Many water services around the United States that are formerly public services have been privatized. Atlanta, San Diego, for some time Stockton in California, were privatized systems where water rights were turned over to corporations to provide water to the general public and out of the hands of government to regulate it as a public good. Another form that this privatization has taken is the bottling of water. And there are a handful of corporations globally that are included in the privatization movement that both seek to take control of public water systems and also seek to take control of water by bottling it and turning it into a private product for sale. In places like Michigan, where corporations like Nestle's corporations have gone into bottled water, what you've seen, despite the objections of people who have organized to try to keep Nestle out, is that the water tables in the surrounding areas have fallen, intermittent streams have dried up, water for farming has become more scarce. It's a serious issue of loss of control. And that's also happening here in Oregon. In fact, right now, Nestle is seeking to put a water bottling plant up along the Cascade Locks along the Columbia. The water bottling plant that they seek to put in not only would take water, let me look at my notes here, not only would take water from the Cascade Locks area, but also part of the water that they would seek to take is from spring water that is actually on state-owned property. And they're seeking to get the state to do an exchange of water for the spring water because, of course, the spring water, when it's bottled, can be sold not in their Pure Life lower class water, but in their Arrowhead water, which they sell as spring water and then more valuable for you as an individual. It's already gone through a series of hearings, but it's still up to the governor to make a recommendation to the appropriate agencies in Oregon as to whether this should be allowed or not. Out in the Hall of Honor, out here where the tables are, there's a table that's on water that has Food and Water Watch information on it. Food and Water Watch is one of the prime groups that's seeking to stop the privatization of water in the United States and certainly have a campaign in Oregon. There are flyers on that table that tell you how to contact the governor to take action on this issue. So when you're leaving today, please pick up one of those flyers. Can somebody do that for me? Yeah, actually, yeah, somebody do that. They're white ones that deal with the governor's question. The other thing I want to talk to you about is, of course, there are things that we can do locally. And here on campus, and also at the University of Oregon, by the way, there are Ban the Bottle, Take Back the Tap campaigns going on. And I'm going to start a petition going around here for people, particularly who are students and staff on campus. If you're interested in keeping bottled water off of this campus, please join the campaign. The campaign is a coalition between the Peace Center, Osberg, and the LCC Sustainability Practices, Institute for Sustainability Practices. And we're hoping that we can get enough momentum with this campaign to push bottled water off of campus. You know, when you think about bottled water, it's really quite crazy. In the United States, at the federal level, there's less than half a job assignment to regulate bottled water in the whole United States. It's far less regulated than tap water is. In general, most bottled water is tap water, and a lot of it comes from sources that you wouldn't want to take the water from because it's in polluted areas. So when you begin to talk about drinking bottled water, it's not healthier for you. In fact, the bottles themselves are, the cells are polluting. They contain chemicals that, as was already said, disrupt your endocrine system, cause cancer. Many of the factories where the bottled water, where the bottles are made, are in low-income areas, so there's social justice issues that go along with it, because in those areas the incidences of cancer and disease are far higher. And of course, bottled water is far, far more expensive. Now, why pay $1.50 for a bottle of water when you can fill a bottle that's not plastic for less than 1 cent? I mean, what kind of sense does that make?
Yeah, I think bottled water has to go and pollutants in the water have to go. But what was said today is true. The main cause, the main usage of water today in America is for agriculture. Yeah, and it's not for agriculture for people. It's for agriculture for animals. So if you want to do more than just preach, you should try to switch over to a mainly plant-based diet, because that requires a hell of a lot less water than a meat or dairy-based diet. In fact, if you leave your shower on all year round and you have to eat a plant-based diet, you're using about the same amount of water as someone who eats steaks and hamburgers and all that stuff.
So for people who couldn't hear, I want to repeat that for the live stream, is that the comment was that the major user of water is industrial agriculture, and that industrial agriculture, we can make changes in our own life, particularly around what we eat, and that if we change to a plant-based diet and move away from a meat-based diet, that would have the biggest impact on how water is used, because most of that water that is used agriculturally goes towards raising animals, particularly beef, that is a second-hand kind of diet. So it's very perceptive, plus the nitrates. So let me just make a couple of more comments, and I don't want to stop the questions, but I want to make a couple of more points. When you look at plastic water bottles, 90% of them go into the landfill or get shipped out into the ocean. There are islands of plastic in the ocean that are the size of Texas that have accumulated in the ocean. This is not a small problem, it's a huge problem. And so all of these things, changing your diet, changing how you approach water in terms of taking it out of your tap instead of buying a bottle that is unhealthy for you and pollutes the environment, all of these things are things that we can do. So I want to encourage people to begin to do those kinds of things. So I heard another question or comment somewhere.
I have two things. I wanted to ask one question. Is it possible, there's so much rain here, try to make it short. Is it possible to make a structure that would have a tap on it, maybe a large with a waterfall type structure, where the water would be purified by rocks and the different things that are natural purification process up through the water? I would catch the rainwater and then bring it out and be healthy. Is it possible?
I know there are systems like that already. I personally am not somebody who's ever built something like that, but if you get in touch with the permaculture community, you'll definitely find people who have that knowledge.
I have one other thing. I'm looking at Matthew, the Holy Bible. In Matthew, there is an encouragement for Christians that believe in God, and that is you can drink any deadly thing and live. I think we should keep the pollution out of the water by all means, because we don't want sewage and all that thing, and that should be stopped. It should be rectified. There's got to be other ways to do it that will not damage the planet and the water. We all want clean water, so I love that. But for encouragement for those that believe that God is King and He created heaven and earth and Jesus is the Savior of the world, it does say that we have an extra protection when we are saved by drinking water. In Matthew, the last chapter in the book of Matthew.
I don't think I can repeat that whole reference, but the reference was to a chapter in Matthew that deals with drinking water, and that the ability to drink water even though it's polluted, I'm not sure.
And that you're not going to have to be under the same, it's not deadly to you because you have extra protection.
You have an extra protection from God. Okay. Last chapter of Matthew. I see one more question to the back, Mark, and then we'll call it a day.
One of the other things about
silicon chip makers are sucking fresh water out of aquifers, making their chips and putting the polluted water back. And so when you're talking about the privatization of water, you have to keep all of those things in mind. And this issue here with nestlings in Oregon, those of you who are students and those of you who are members of the community, you need to step up and keep them out of here because they're going to move from the gorges area over there to other areas in your western water-rich part of this state. And they're going to rape it, and they're going to continue moving all the way up and down the United States until somebody stands up, and that's what your job is, stand up and stop.
So, for those of you who couldn't hear Mark, that's Mark Franco, and he was saying that the issue isn't just privatization, that when privatization takes place, what we're seeing is the aquifers being drained because they drain so much water out of the ground and also pollute the area as they do it and then move on. So we need to stand up to deal with that. So I want to, just one more thing before we finish. I want to get people's attention to the art that's around the room. This art is by Janet Esley. She is our featured artist for the symposium. And all of these represent daughters of the earth. And most of them are pictures of actual indigenous women who have been engaged in environmental resistance to stop destruction of the earth. Janet is going to be at 3 o'clock giving a talk about these paintings that are here, and I certainly urge you to stick around to hear Janet. And then, of course, this evening we have another round this evening from 6 to 9:30, where all of the speakers that have talked today, plus Mayor Kitty Piercy, will be here to present. So please come back. And I see one more question, and then we'll call it.
I was wondering, he said to stand up. Is that the best way to stand up? Is that to contact the lady, that the other lady we talked about? She said to county commissioners.
That certainly is an important way, is to contact.
Contact information. What is the bill that's on the floor that they?
To answer this, Teresa?
Yeah, sure. So that was about the bill that would delay implementation of the toxics rulemaking. That's called House Bill 2007, and it's in the House
I've done it
Transportation
already.
and Economic Development.
So we need to call representatives and tell them to kill that bill.
Yeah.
Okay. I have one more announcement, and it goes back to the Wild Salmon Party and Benefit. And part of that event is a running event. Many of the Winnemem youth have come up to be part of this run, but they're inviting others who would like to be part of the run to join. And that run begins at 1 o'clock, so you need to get there a little early to participate. Right? And that's tomorrow at Saturday, and that starts at Amigos Multicultural Center on 21 Grand Street, North Grand Street. So hope to see you later this evening. Thank you.